Hi, everyone. I just wanted to pick up a little bit where I left off. I don't think this video will go the whole 15 minutes, but I just wanted to make sure that I didn't rush through this last part about stock because it's a complicated part of a corporation. But the other piece that I want to make sure was mentioned here is that the reason that this is so critical for a corporation is that the issuing of stock is what allows a company to grow. It's not that a limited liability company can't seek investors, it can. It's just that there isn't a structure set up to issue shares of a limited liability company the same way it is set up for a corporation. In fact, one of the most attractive features about a corporation for investors to seek that money to allow them to grow is that a corporation, by its very nature, allows the company to create different classes of stock, and then within each class of stock, different series. Now, I don't need you to memorize all the differences between the types of stock, but different types of classes of stock give the owners of that stock, that is the shareholders, the investors, different rights. And it allows some classes of stock certain voting rights and certain rights in the company, and others it allows for more aggressive growth for those investors. And that is what is key to seeking those investors and having the ability to grow your corporation through the issuance of stock. So I just mentioned on this PowerPoint the words common stock and preferred stock. So take a look at your book at those definitions and see the differences, because for each one, there's a difference between how and when you receive a dividend that is a payment back to you on that stock, whether you have voting rights, the right to vote as a shareholder, and that is important, as we'll talk about in our next unit, because the shareholders elect, and actually the next slide too, elect the board of directors and help determine the direction of the company. But not every shareholder has voting rights. So take a look at the dividend rights, the voting rights, the conversion rights, the right to change your type of stock from one to another, and then also the rights during a liquidation. Liquidation is what happens when a company fails and it basically goes through bankruptcy, and not everybody gets paid off the same right at the beginning. So again, the most important takeaway here is that for growth purposes, a corporation is the best structure because of the issuance of stock and the different types of stock that can be issued that allows for more investors, different types of investors, and encourages those types of investors, really. And it all ties back to the charter because the issuance of the stock must be indicated in that charter. Okay, so a little bit more about growing the corporation, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the corporation ends. Just a little bit about the corporation to begin with. Again, another characteristic of the corporation that sets it apart from the general partnership, the limited liability company, and of course the sole proprietorship is the structure of management built into the corporation. Now, when you're a sole proprietor, back to that slide, that is the easiest type of business to manage because it's just yourself. When you're talking about a general partnership, you and the general partner can decide how you want to manage that company, and then you can put your guidance down into a partnership agreement. A limited liability company is not so different because the LLC, a benefit is, again, it allows for that flexibility in management, and that the members of the limited liability company can create through their operating agreement how they want the company to be run. But now let's talk about a corporation. A corporation is very different because the law says, hey, you're a corporation, here is your management structure. A corporation must have shareholders. Shareholders, of course, we've been talking about them with stock, but shareholders are your owners. They're your investors in the company. And one right that shareholders have, and again, take a look because it's not all shareholders, shareholders have the right to elect directors. Directors are responsible for big picture decisions of the company, how the company is going to grow or not grow, invest in overseas offices, invest in new technologies. So big picture, long-term decisions are managed by a board of directors. So a corporation doesn't have a choice whether to have a board of directors. They must have a board of directors. How many directors the corporation has is up to the corporation itself, but the fact of having the board of directors, they must have one. The directors have, among their roles of making big picture decisions, is also the hiring of officers. Now, your officers include the president, the vice president, the secretary, and the treasurer of the corporation. In some jurisdictions, in some states, we also use the word CEO, Chief Executive Officer, COO, CFO. And sometimes these individuals can hold more than one title. But these are separate individuals from the shareholders and from the board of directors. And you can see the line I drew here. Shareholders elect the directors. Directors appoint or hire the CEO, the president of the company. So what's the difference between these officers and the directors? Because they hope both roles help manage the company. The big difference is that, as I mentioned, directors are responsible for big picture decisions. The officers are responsible for the day-to-day management of the company. These people work for the company. They are there every day running the day-to-day operations. For example, a company might have several vice presidents of the company, each responsible for a different piece. Maybe a vice president for real estate and property, maybe a vice president for employment, the chief information officer, it could be responsible for all the technology of the company and security. So these officers take on different management roles. Officers also have the ability to sign documents on behalf of the corporation, including, for example, a lease. So officers have the ability to bind the corporation through their actions. So again, something really important here, all corporations must have officers and directors, and they must use the names designated by the state corporate law. A couple of other small things to point out here is corporations must hold regular meetings and must keep minutes of those meetings that are generally available to the shareholders to see. When you're a sole proprietor, you definitely don't have to have meetings. You can just talk to yourself. When you're a general partnership or a limited liability company, then you can decide when you want to have these meetings. I mean, you should have them regularly and you should take minutes, but the corporation sets out this structure. Corporations are also required to have bylaws. Bylaws is basically an adopted rule book for how the corporation is going to operate. And the corporation is bound by its bylaws. The corporation can't just say, well, we don't really feel like having meetings today, so let's not have meetings. No. If the bylaws say there shall be certain meetings every Friday, then you will have those meetings. And the corporation is bound by its own bylaws. The corporation can change those bylaws, but they must go through the process of changing them and then adhere to those changes. The corporation must also follow its own rules for how to change those bylaws. So you can already see, and we haven't even mentioned the corporation, the filing fees. I'm going to do that separately, but you can see just how involved and how structured a corporation is. Again, though, this doesn't mean a corporation is a bad thing. In fact, most investors still like investing in a corporation. And that's why we still have so many corporations, because sometimes the structure is exactly what we need to be best at what we do. All right, certainly last but not least, what about ending a corporation? Of course, very different from ending a sole proprietorship or ending a partnership or a limited liability company. So one thing to mention before how to end a corporation is just to remind ourselves that as its own legal distinct entity, we've already mentioned that corporations can essentially enter into their own contracts. The vice president might sign them, but the name of the contract has the name of the corporation in it. Corporations can also sue and be sued. You can slip and fall and sue McDonald's. You're not suing the person behind McDonald's. So this means that when a shareholder or group of shareholders dies, the corporation doesn't go away. The corporation continues on, but it doesn't have to, because a corporation can come to an end. The shareholders, the investors, can vote to terminate or end the corporation. That can certainly happen. But the one that I really want to mention here is something called piercing the corporate veil. This is another way a corporation comes to an end. And in a very short version, the corporation, a piercing of the corporate veil happens when the corporation has not observed the formalities required by corporate law, like holding the minutes that you're supposed to have, filing the appropriate filings with the state every single year and paying fees, maybe deciding to issue shares of stock that are not in your charter and not amending the charter. Every time a corporation ceases to act like a corporation and follow the guidance for how a corporation is supposed to act, it puts itself at risk for not being treated as a corporation anymore. And guess what it gets treated as? Did you guess? A general partnership. And remember, the huge risk with a general partnership is not having limited liability, having that unlimited liability. And investors don't want that. So it's really important that a corporation follow all corporate formalities, or the corporation could be ended or terminated through lawsuits in which a plaintiff pierces that corporate veil and says, guess what? No more limited liability. Okay, so this ends the big highlights that I want to tell you guys about beginning and ending a corporation. I know it's a pretty dense chapter in your book too. I'm not going to ask you to memorize every little single nuance about it, but I want you to see very much how different a corporation is in terms of how it is organized and managed versus the other types of business entities. I will create one more small PowerPoint for you guys, just because I want to show you the Secretary of Commonwealth's website. You will need to use that website to also help do your create a business assignment. Okay, thanks.